Rhaenyra may call herself a queen, but she has a woman's parts, a woman's faint heart, and a mother's fear. Aemond Targaryen to Criston Cole, fire and blood, the dying of the dragons, Rhaenyra triumphant. King Viserys I Targaryen naming Rhaenyra his heir after the death of Aemma Arryn and baby Baelon in itself isn't out of the norm, and given lack of sons is in line with the succession system up until this point, especially when you consider the next best option was Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince. What was out of the ordinary is Viserys keeping Rhaenyra as his heir after the birth of Aegon, whom many expected to become Viserys' heir upon his birth. Yet, Viserys kept Rhaenyra his named heir, and never relented from that, despite her numerous scandals and pressure from many sides to name Aegon. Whether you agree with Viserys' choice or not, or want to argue the legality of it, one thing is clear: Rhaenyra was his intended heir. Despite naming Rhaenyra his heir and granting her the title of Princess of Dragonstone, Viserys arguably never prepared her for rule to the extent he needed to, which would have disastrous effects once the Dance of the Dragons came. While he did take several important steps early in her life, he failed to build upon that foundation as the political situation around him deteriorated. Thus, when Rhaenyra did eventually reclaim the throne, briefly during the Dance of the Dragons, she was woefully unprepared for the challenges of ruling. Yes, they were in the middle of a civil war, which doesn't help, but some of the choices Viserys made left her without a strong foundation to build from. In fact, if Viserys had been a bit more aware and attentive to the situation brewing within his family, and Rhaenyra did have that strong foundation, it might be possible that her succession goes unchallenged by the Greens and Aegon II. So in this video, we're going to be breaking down how Viserys failed Rhaenyra by not preparing her to rule, creating the circumstances that her succession could be challenged in the process. What seems to be common practice with the early Targaryen kings is they really spent a lot of time preparing their heirs to rule in several different ways in which Viserys attempted with Rhaenyra but didn't really commit to. So if we take a look at all of the named heirs prior to Rhaenyra, you get a good picture of what these kings did. From a very young age, King Aegon I groomed and readied Aenys to rule. After the death of his mother, Queen Rhaenys, Aenys was a constant sight at his father's side as he sat to the Iron Throne or attended small council meetings. Aenys also went with his father on several diplomatic meetings, most notably to Dorne, and Aenys and his wife Alyssa would eventually take over the royal progresses once Aegon grew too old. What we see here is not just Aegon teaching his son to rule, but also slowly handing elements of his role as king over to him, such as the royal progresses. It's clear that Aegon was readying Aenys for the throne in a way he didn't do with his other son, Maegor. But for all that work and preparation, it seemed that Aenys' heir, Prince Aegon, never got the same degree of training, from what we can tell. However, we must factor in this case that Aenys did die very young, and may perhaps didn't have the time his father had to train him as heir. King Jaehaerys evidently groomed Aemon as his heir for decades. Much like Aegon and Aenys, Jaehaerys took Aemon with him on several diplomatic missions, and had him attending council meetings. Aemon also went on several royal progresses, both with his father and solo. I think it also speaks a lot that Jaehaerys had Aemon lead the campaign in Tarth, which should have been a quick and easy war. Aemon's death there was very sudden, with Jaehaerys next naming his second son Baelon his heir, but given the age of Jaehaerys at this time, he didn't really have long to ready him for rule. He did make him Prince of Dragonstone, and in 100 AC, Hand the King, which is effectively the second most important person in the realm in terms of governance. They rule in the king's place when the king is absent. Given Jaehaerys' advanced age at the time, it makes sense that Baelon was effectively now ruling the realm for his father. It means that if he had become king, he would be working with a small council he knew, and would have years of experience functionally doing the job of ruling. Kinda like Aegon the Uncrowned, Viserys didn't get much time to learn. He was named heir in 101 AC and became king in 103. The issue is King Jaehaerys was very old, frail and ill, and not in much of a state to pass on wisdom to his heir, which is why Viserys would rely so heavily on more experienced men around him, such as Otto Hightower, the then Hand of the King. And it's why Otto became such a key part of the running of Viserys' realm, and why he looked to Otto for advice so frequently. So there does seem to be 3 common things kings do to prepare their heirs for rule. If they have time and are physically able, they name them Prince of Dragonstone. They have them conduct royal progresses, and they often accompany their fathers to small council meetings and important political events. In a few notable cases, they are even named Hand of the King. Viserys I Targaryen was not the strongest-willed of kings, it must be said, always amiable and anxious to please. He relied greatly on the counsel of men around him, and did as they bid more often than not. The writings of Archmaester Gyldain on King Viserys I, Fire and Blood, Heirs of the Dragon, A Question of Succession. So, we've now identified what the kings can do to train their heirs. But why are these things actually important? And how does this lead to Viserys failing to prepare Rhaenyra? In most cases, the title of Prince of Dragonstone is given to the king's heir. In effect, the heir to the throne is given the seat of Dragonstone and its associated lands and incomes to rule themselves, effectively acting as the lord, if that makes sense. They do the job of a lord, holding court and dealing with local issues and the issues of the small folk. Not every heir becomes Prince of Dragonstone. For example, the first Prince of Dragonstone was Maegor the Cruel, whom was actually never Aegon's official heir. It's not until Maegor's exile from Westeros in 41 AC, King Aenys named his own heir, Prince Aegon the Uncrowned, as the Prince of Dragonstone. After that, it seems to have become a tradition for heirs to be granted the title. It does seem the title is not something automatically given. For the early part of King Jaehaerys' reign, until the birth of Prince Aemond, there was no Prince of Dragonstone. And even then, Aemon was not given the title till he came of age. Viserys refused to name Daemon Prince of Dragonstone multiple times, meaning no one held the title until he named Rhaenyra his heir in 105 AC, where he also granted her the title of Princess of Dragonstone. So while holding the title does add some legitimacy to the claim to the throne of the heir, it also functionally helps them prepare to sit the Iron Throne one day, as they hold effective lordship over Dragonstone, and effectively run this smaller domain. Yeah, it's not exactly the same as running the Seven Kingdoms themselves, but it does go a long way to make sure they're not utterly overwhelmed when the transition of power comes. Not all that hold the title will spend that much time at their seat, depending on their circumstances. But in the case of Rhaenyra Targaryen, given the tensions and difficult rumours at court in King's Landing, spent most of her adult life on Dragonstone, which, while did help her gain ruling experience, did cause some huge issues in the fact that hindered her ability to rule effectively as queen. The idea of the heir being Prince of Dragonstone and then using that as training kinda mimics real-world history, where since 1301, the title of Prince of Wales has been given to the heir apparent to the English and later British crown. The idea is used in a similar fashion for Prince of Dragonstone. In the modern era, the title of Prince of Wales is more tradition than really a set of training wheels, if that makes sense. So what are royal progresses, and why are they important to this conversation? They are effectively a political tool, almost like medieval marketing. The king tours his kingdom, meeting his lords, talking to his small folk, holding meetings. Lots of things come out of them, from trade deals, marriage pacts, fosterings of wards. The key thing is the king is coming to his people. But most of all, they build bonds between the royal family, the lords and the small folk. These progresses can go on from a few weeks to a few months. King Aegon the Conqueror is known to have spent 6 months of the year travelling his kingdom, meeting his people. They would often start in King's Landing, with one of the great seats of power as the endpoint. For example, King Aenys, early in his reign, took a royal progress through the Reach to Old Town via Highgarden. King Jaehaerys and Queen Alicent, over their long reign, took progresses to all of the kingdoms of Westeros, save for the Iron Islands and of course Dorne, who were not yet part of the realm under the Iron Throne. Marriages were made, new laws enacted. In fact, through Queen Alicent's women's courts, the rights of women in Westeros were forever changed, including the outlawing of the right to the first night and the introduction of the widow's law. While these tours were mostly conducted by the king and queen, heirs would often join them as well, making this a good opportunity for them to learn about their kingdom and how they could one day rule it, how new laws are made, and the importance of diplomacy with things such as marriage pacts. King Viserys and Rhaenyra Targaryen made several tours to the Riverlands, the Westerlands and the Reach in 112 AC when she was 15 years of age. She spent time at Raventree Hall, Stone Hedge, the Twins, Riverrun, Harrenhal, Casterly Rock, Highgarden, Old Oak, Horn Hill. The progress was ostensibly to try and find a match for Rhaenyra, given some of the scandal brewing around her at court. But as the king's named heir, she likely observed many political meetings held during this journey, and saw firsthand how Viserys governed the realm. In fact, some of the houses she visited and spent significant time at, such as the Blackwoods of Raventree Hall, would later be one of the key river lords to back her claim at the start of the Dance of the Dragons. They say the hand dreams the king's dreams, speaks with the king's voice, and rules with the king's sword. Peter Baelish to Eddard Stark on The Hand of the King, A Game of Thrones Chapter 35, Eddard 9. There have been some cases where heirs have been named Hand of the King, and doing this makes a hell of a lot of sense. King Jaehaerys named Balon the Brave Hand, and then we have King Daeron II, who famously named Prince Baelor Breakspear as Hand, a man who could have been the best king Westeros had ever seen until his untimely death at Ashford Meadow. The idea here is the Hand is the second most powerful person in the realm, after the king himself. They very much deal with the day-to-day governance of the realm and hold court in the king's place when the king is indisposed. Being Hand is almost like training wheels for becoming king. You build a strong working relationship with the small council and fully understand the ruling of the realm and all that entails. The issue is, both heirs whom were named Hand died before they became king. Thus we cannot say how much of an impact being Hand ultimately could have played on their reigns. But both Balon the Brave and Baelor Breakspear are seen as two huge losses for the Targaryen dynasty, men who could have become great kings. So one of the biggest things that a lot of readers point to that Viserys could have done to secure Rhaenyra's rule was to name her Hand of the King. But I don't think this is going to have the impact a lot of fans believe it would. Yes, it would help make Rhaenyra a more competent ruler when the time comes. Yes, Otto Hightower would not have had the same level of influence and power at court. He'd most likely be in Oldtown. And yes, the small council would be loyal to Rhaenyra. When Viserys becomes too ill to sit the Iron Throne, it would be Rhaenyra who ruled in his place, rather than Alicent acting as regent, or Otto Hightower. All these things are true, but here's the issue. You can't reasonably name a teenager Hand. It's such an important role, you need someone more tested. Plus, the way her gender plays a huge part in the pushback to her being heir, the same would apply with her being named Hand. There would of course be pushback from the same people who opposed her being named heir in the first place. The issue is, by the time Rhaenyra is reasonably old enough to maybe be considered Hand, the scandal of the parentage of her sons had already begun to spread. Thus, why she self-isolated herself on Dragonstone for much of her adult life, only occasionally returning to court when circumstances demanded her presence. The issue Rhaenyra then faces is without anyone at court fighting her corner, Otto is able to load the small council with members loyal to the Greens, and the whispers about Rhaenyra are allowed to flourish without any true consequence. So yes, naming Rhaenyra Hand would have hugely helped in some areas, just the practicality of actually doing it is a lot more complex than it first seems. So did Viserys fail Rhaenyra by not preparing her to rule? Did he create the circumstances that meant that when she did come to power, when she did seize King's Landing in the middle of the dance, that she wasn't an effective ruler? Yes and no. In her youth you can see that Viserys did make a lot of effort to treat Rhaenyra as his heir and teach her. She attended council meetings, she was made Princess of Dragonstone, she went on several high-profile royal progresses. He in fact did a lot to teach her like any king would his heir, and he publicly did these things to ensure the rest of the world knew she was his named heir, whether they agreed with that or not. The issue really seems to come after Rhaenyra's marriage to Laenor Velaryon, or just prior. Thanks to the scandals at court, she did isolate herself on Dragonstone, only occasionally returning to the Red Keep. She wasn't necessarily part of day-to-day court life, out of sight, out of mind, which in turn allows rumours to heighten and for the Greens to create a strong base of power. Don't get me wrong, she was still the Princess of Dragonstone, but not being an active part of court isolated her from allies she could have made. This isolation seemed very much Rhaenyra's own choice to some extent, to escape the whispers that followed her. Thus by the time she was old enough and experienced enough, being Hand of the King wasn't going to be possible and would not have been accepted. The thing is, Viserys became ill very quickly, and as he became more ill, the influence of Otto Hightower and Alicent grew ever larger. We must also take into consideration that Viserys did die young. If he remained fit and healthy, he may have had a greater opportunity to bring her into the day-to-day governance, and maybe even one day make her hand. The thing here is, as we've discussed, it's not this silver bullet it seems. Could Viserys have done more? Yes. Did he bury his head in the sand to the reality of the situation brewing within his family? Yes. But there are some mitigating factors, such as his health, his early death, and Rhaenyra's age when she began to isolate on Dragonstone, that also played such a huge role too.